My name is Dominique Thomas, and I'm the editor of the Community Psychologist. I was born in Gulfport, Mississippi, and grew up there before I went to Atlanta and received my bachelor's in psychology from Morehouse College. I earned my master's and PhD in community psychology from Georgia State University. I was a lecturer at Georgia State for 1 year before I moved to the University of Michigan for a scholarship to practice fellowship in the National Center for Institutional Diversity. My research interests are in Black identity, racial socialization, activism, Afrofuturism, and Black student experiences with campus racial climate. I've taught African American psychology and community psychology. I've also been a consultant and program evaluator for different organizations.
So I'm going to shift it over to Alana so that she can introduce herself.
Hey there, my name is Dr. Alana Zuckerman, and I am the new associate editor of the TCP. I am so excited to work with Dr. Thomas as editor for the next 3 years. To share a little bit about myself, professionally, I graduated from Pomona College with a bachelor's in psychology and Africana studies. After that, I went to Georgia State University, where I completed my master's and my PhD in community psychology. My background includes academic research, data analysis, program evaluation, as well as undergraduate level instruction. My research has focused on examining culturally relevant protective factors against the mitigating effects of racial discrimination and campus racial climate, particularly for Black college students. The factors I've examined include racial socialization, racial identity, individual and institutional discrimination, including campus racial climate. Currently, I'm a residential faculty member in the Psychological Science Department at Mesa Community College in Mesa, Arizona. Again, I'm so excited to be here. I cannot wait to get into our first ever TCP podcast.
The goal of our podcast is to extend the conversation started in the newsletter issues. We want to provide space for a deeper discussion on topics and to have a more direct dialogue with readers.
So this also isn't the first time that we've worked together on something. I mean, when did we start our program? 2011? Wow, it's almost been 10 years.
Yeah, 2011.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. As a friend of mine would say, you come from far.
Yeah, we'll have to do a special shout out this summer when it's actually 10 years.
For real,
Oh
like
my goodness.
now I just realized we got to commemorate that somehow.
Right.
But yeah, so we know each other very well. We started our graduate program at Georgia State in the same time, and we also started in the same lab.
Mhm.
So that we had a lot of pretty much the same experiences in terms of research and practice, working in a lot of the same spheres.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of those conversations that came from our experiences in those spaces and our work together really led to those additional projects that we ended up doing together, like the Black Lives Matter Roundtable, which then led to the special issue in the Journal of Community Psychology and Global Perspectives, and then also the Mentoring Roundtable that we did, which then led to that publication with TCP, which was over 6 years ago, I think now. So it's kind of really interesting to see that come full circle. But yeah, so can you tell us more about the mentoring roundtable?
For example, in the area of mentoring, during the 2015 biennial, we organized a roundtable on mentoring in which we invited students and faculty to discuss mentoring and ways we can improve mentor-mentee relationships in the field. We were disheartened when only one faculty member attended, but we made the best of the situation and left with ideas we could incorporate into a future TCP article. We decided to keep the conversation going by discussing the things we covered in the roundtable as well as what we found in the mentoring literature. Through our time in graduate school and as professionals, we have observed several overarching issues. We have tried to use our research and practice experiences to create different solutions. Another area in which we thought about different things we noticed was in the area of the curricula. So one scholar who I really have been influenced by and have been reading their work for a long time has been Frantz Fanon. And Franz Fanon is considered a founding father of the African liberation movement. He discussed the nature of ideology as it relates to race and national culture. His political philosophy confronted the ideological structures of colonialism and promoted indigenous political theories of democratization. Fanon's insights can be used to understand how the racial discourse in the United States has been appropriated, particularly through academic institutions and disciplines, including psychology, in similar ways as justification for slavery, Jim Crow, and other institutionalized social control of Black and African people, as well as militarism and other forms of imperialism. So I think about this in the context of the intellectual history and general context of community psychology as it emerged. So he provided two important insights that can be used to describe the continued colonial condition in the United States. So, one, in the aftermath of an anti-colonial struggle, the group most likely to gain power would be a quote-unquote native petite bourgeoisie. So if you think about this in the perspective of, say, the American Revolution, this would be the land-owning white men who would then assume to be the powerful group in America post the Revolutionary War. And two, also related to this, it would not be the working people of the groups of the society. So it wouldn't be the white men without property, women, or the people, or the Black people and Africans who were enslaved, or the indigenous people whose land were taken and stolen via violence and other forms of genocide. And two, this new ruling class would appropriate the racial discourse of the previous ruling class so they can maintain their positions as elites. So even though they were creating a new democracy, they still ended up inheriting a slave system and then continuing to maintain that slave system. Unfortunately, maintaining this type of racial discourse also involves help from the academy. So academic institutions participate in the maintenance of the status quo through the production of knowledge and the reproduction of knowers. This is no different for the racial discourse in service of colonial structures. Institutions like Harvard were intimately involved in the cotton plantation economy. Harvard's ascent to global prominence was heavily aided by the donations and services of New England textile mill owners and British banks, both vital segments of the cotton plantation economy. Additionally, Harvard professor Louis Agassiz, I hope I said that right, was a prominent scientist who helped create racial theories that turned personality traits into biological characteristics of race. These hidden facts were uncovered by diligent students engaged in rigorous archival research through Harvard documents. Harvard is but one example of Fanon's warning of the appropriation of racial discourse to uphold colonial power relations. Plantation owners had aspirations of empire, so they expanded their representations of reality into the social sciences. White supremacy as an ideology of a plantation owner's view of reality is what founded the U.S. academic discourse on race, institutionalizing planocrats' views of economics, history, biology, sociology, and psychology. Social Darwinism was the dominant academic perspective on Black life in America. Leading academic research was conducted by Confederate soldiers, historians, and political economists.
Yes, absolutely. And social Darwinism and the social sciences really provided an empirical rationale for the hierarchical order of racial groups. Dr. William H. Watkins wrote about this in his book, The White Architects of Black Education. And I have a quote from this book where Dr. Watkins writes, "Scientific racism cannot be separated from the economic and political order. Scientific racism was indeed the centerpiece of the new social science, which presented human difference as rationale for inequality. Scientific racism also could explain the capitalist exploitation of labor, the factory system, and the usurpation of power by northern industrialists. Most importantly, scientific racism justified the hierarchical order of races as historically evolved, divinely ordained, and socially expeditious." These are extremely powerful words that Dr. Watkins writes, and this also really means the production of knowledge within academic spaces was deeply influenced by and connected to this economic and political order from which these academic spaces themselves reside in.
empirical social science attached to black people: criminality, lack of industrial efficiency, child neglect, low intelligence, and sexual deviance. Theories of African barbarism and inferiority were justification for imperialist occupation of Haiti, Hawaii, Cuba, and the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and other nations. Intelligence tests created by psychologists would be used in schools and the military to justify segregation in these spaces. For example, psychologist Lewis Terman adapted the Stanford Binet IQ test and promoted racially segregating BIPOC students from white students. Terman sat on the board of several eugenics organizations while his intelligence test would be widely used.
Yes, absolutely. And really by the 20th century, scientific racism began to utilize mathematics to quantify racial superiority and inferiority. This was especially the case with the eugenics movement, which used biometrics as well as intelligence testing, as you were just talking about, Dominique, to validate a hierarchy of racial superiority. There are a number of academic psychologists whose research supported genetic theories for inheritance of IQ towards emphasizing these racial and class disparities, and they wrote prolifically with the specified purpose of providing mathematical validation for white supremacy. For example, psychologist Arthur Jensen continued the eugenics legacy well into the 20th century by using scores on intelligence tests to validate white supremacy, all under the guise of supposed mathematical objectivity. A little over 10 years ago, I actually did a content analysis for my McNair Scholar research project, where I looked at Jensen's work to really get a grasp of just how prolific his work was. And I searched for articles from 1950 to 2000 and found that he authored 432 articles in that time. And this was using a PsycInfo search. The majority of the articles from those 432 that I found were sole authorship and on the topics of intelligence, race, and heritability. Furthermore, Jensen was published in over 122 journals. So this is not solely the work of one person, but rather a larger system that actively worked to promote research on racial differences and intelligence testing as providing empirical evidence for genetic differences that could be used to validate white supremacy. This includes researchers themselves, institutions from which they work, funding agents who fund their work, editorial boards that peer review and ultimately decide who gets to be considered producers of knowledge and even what constitutes knowledge itself. And the genetic inferiority theory for IQ differences really accepts that IQ differences between racial groups is reflective of some sort of innate genetic superiority of white people over Black, Indigenous people of color, thereby effectively drawing attention away from any type of critique of these larger systems from which this research is actually born, or the economic, social, and political influences on the research itself. The production and creation and dissemination of knowledge within the academy leads to these real world changes and has policy implications beyond the academy, especially speaking to your point, Dominique, about IQ testing and being a rationale for segregation, that being a very clear example. We all have a variety of roles, right? As researchers working within communities, as scholars who are producing knowledge, as editors on peer review research journals, as educators within our academic institutions. We have a social responsibility to not only produce and critique academic research, but to ensure that we know the full history of it, as well as including situating academic research within the larger socio-historical, political, and economic systems in which the academy exists.
Black codes and Jim Crow laws also perform the psychological feat of giving a white racial identity social meaning in a racially segregated society, allowing white men without land ownership access to citizenship. This allowed white racial identity to be a form of property.
Yes, and that actually makes me think about a piece by Cheryl Harris titled Whiteness as Property, where she describes the process by which property rights are intricately linked and connected with race. By introducing a racial caste system, essentially white landowning men in power were able to provide ideological justification for colonization and for slavery. Furthermore, by placing Black people at the bottom of this racial caste system, this allowed for an ideological justification for the treatment of enslaved Africans as property specifically. So this then creates a theory, or a definition rather, of property wherein only somebody who has a white racial identity can possess property. And that is recognized by law. Therefore, this is creating a racialized definition of property and property ownership, wherein you can only own property if you are white. Whiteness, therefore, became the very symbol of freedom. White identity became inextricably linked to tangible privileges such as economic advancement and freedom from generational bondage. Cheryl Harris writes, becoming white meant gaining access to a whole set of public and private privileges that materially and permanently guaranteed basic subsistence needs and therefore survival. Her words here provide context for what was called the one drop rule, meaning that one drop of black blood meant you were considered black and could not be considered white by law because being white guaranteed certain privileges and protections. So by creating a legal definition of whiteness predicated on literal blood instead of physical or social cues, this ensured that fair-skinned or mixed black people who did not physically appear black were excluded from a legal definition of whiteness. Being white now became something one had to prove in order to access rights and privileges that only whiteness could acquire. Cheryl Harris then goes on to write that whiteness as racialized privilege was then legitimized by science and then embraced in legal doctrine as objective fact. This quote provides further context for the legacy of white supremacy and how institutions such as the academy and the legal system have been used to enforce and uphold the status quo.
In many cases, the police also participated in violently upholding the social order and defending the property of whiteness. They served as an institutional form of the slave patrol and Indian catchers. Unfortunately, violent policing of black people has never been solely the domain of official state agents. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 called on all white citizens to do their part in recovering quote-unquote fugitives and returning them to the plantation from which they escaped. The Dred Scott Supreme Court case ruled that black people had no rights a white person was obligated to respect. Black people were targeted as a population to be managed and controlled, essentially colonized by white society. Vigilante terrorist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan were informally deputized to keep black populations disempowered and in terror, killing thousands and driving away millions to other regions of the country. Often their ranks consisted of citizens, ministers, and lawyers. To dispel the notion that American racism in its most explicit forms is a particularly Southern phenomenon, let us consider the fact that Ku Klux Klan membership reached 8.9 million in 1925, with most members being from northern states. For example, Michigan had 875,000 KKK members, while Mississippi had 93,000 members. Did the South rejoin the Union, or did the North join the Confederacy? When explicit race-based rhetoric became unfashionable, Southern social science reorganized to provide more race-neutral and socially acceptable explanations for poverty. This allowed planocrats the ability to craft a regional identity that masked the racial and economic inequalities that maintained their power in the Mississippi Delta region. Objectivity was a veil to shroud the racial hierarchy still promoted by social sciences. Instead of biological inferiority, the explanation shifted to cultural deficiencies. The concessions gained from the civil rights movement gave way to law and order and the war on drugs, leading to the increased police presence and surveillance of black communities. The Black Panther Party would use Fanon's work to connect police control of black communities to other colonial situations in the African diaspora and global South. They demonstrated how often the police served as domestic arms of American imperialism. There have been several high-profile cases throughout decades that have brought public awareness, yet they also demonstrate how black lives can be taken with little consequence, as many officers are not indicted by grand juries or significantly reprimanded by their departments. Police violence exacerbates the already negative effects of racial capitalism on physical and mental health. African Americans are overrepresented in cases involving the use of force such as tasers, canines, spray, hands and body use, and weapon use. According to The Guardian, in 2015 to 2016, African Americans made up 12 to 15% of the U.S. population, but accounted for more than 30% of unarmed individuals killed by police officers. This hyper-surveillance of black communities has harmful and destabilizing effects on people and their families. This environmental stressor erodes social cohesion and creates a dual psychological and physical effect. The threat of police brutality places black communities under a state of psychological stress, leading to worse physical health. This hyper-surveillance also furthers their political and economic exploitation. The 2014 murder of 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri took place within this colonial context of hyper-surveillance and economic exploitation. The predominantly black community had already experienced parasitic governing practices at the hands of their municipal officials and police, leaving many people with excessive fines and living in fear of being arrested for lack of payment. With this historical context and everything that had been happening during our time as graduate students, we also felt that there wasn't enough discussion in the field about these incidents and these problems that were so apparently manifest, but it seemed like there wasn't as much of a discussion about or around them, even though we're seeing like people, like it seems like regularly there's a different video or some type of footage of someone being assaulted or brutalized by police officers. We just thought that, why aren't we talking about this more? And this is also during the emergence of Black Lives Matter as well, becoming a big thing. So it was also the question of, well, why is it that it's community psychology we aren't really talking about something that's clearly bubbling up in the zeitgeist? We sought to begin this conversation in a safe space among graduate students and community faculty alike. While many of us were having these conversations in silos with few other graduate students and faculty members, often the few other students or faculty of color, we wanted to bring these conversations to a larger space. So we wanted to discuss ways in which we could incorporate and learn from the movement, but also to learn from our colleagues about the different work that they may do within or outside of academia that works to address anti-Black racism and systemic injustice. So we began by contextualizing the current climate regarding the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the killing of Trayvon Martin and the continued national emergence of police and civilian level violence against Black boys, girls, men, and women without justice for any of their families or communities. So we created a roundtable largely born from these conversations between us about the role of social justice in community psychology and where Black Lives Matter may fit into larger conversations about social justice. So at this roundtable we had at the 2016 Southeast Eco Conference, we asked people questions about whether they knew anyone that was involved or if they were themselves involved, and what were some of the ways in which we could either learn from what was being done, or if any way community psychologists could actually also participate in this social change effort. So we utilized discussion generated from questions we asked to construct another roundtable that we would host at the 2017 biennial. So we discussed the varying degrees of activism, both professional and what it means to be an activist. So this arose from a question about balancing personal and professional forms of activism. And we also asked questions of, how are people conceiving or conceptualizing what activism is? And how is it related to Black Lives Matter, particularly for those of us for whom the personal is often political in some sense? Because while these are, things that we're talking about in terms of broader political changes, these still also have an impact on individual human beings, and there are the people who experience these policies firsthand who have a particular knowledge that isn't always respected. And lastly, we ended with different ways in which we could take this experience and discussion to our home institutions. So this is where we then moved on to making it into the roundtable for the SCRA biennial. So we kind of provided a brief overview of what Black Lives Matter was, and kind of made some of the same points that we had made at the smaller Eco Conference, but a little bit more fleshed out in a sense. So while preparing for the roundtable, the aforementioned question came up: do Black Lives matter in community psychology? And these doubts led to another question: What does it mean to use theories and frameworks normed and created by white men to apply to marginalized communities? Scholars like Patricia Hill Collins, W.E.B. Du Bois, Bell Hooks, Frantz Fanon, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, they've all conducted research that has influenced social movements spanning over the last half century, yet their names are rarely, if ever, mentioned in the field as influences or even adjacent to community psychology. Frameworks like critical race theory and intersectionality align perfectly with what we would think is the social criticism inherent in the field, yet these theories and the scholars who developed them are not really included in the canon of community psychology. So when we brought these points up at the roundtable, many people nodded their heads in agreement that there was an issue to be fixed. Others pointed out that similar issues had been brought up before, with not much having changed after. The goal in the question was to promote a critical reflexivity. We wanted to ensure that in this future research area, CP does not end up perpetuating the same oppressive structures and hierarchies that it seeks to dismantle. At the end of the roundtable, we provided a list of articles and books relevant to the discussion. We dubbed it the hashtag Black Lives Matter syllabus for community psychology. We hoped to expand the conversation and spur more research within this area. Initially, we only planned to publish the syllabus or some other piece based on our biennial roundtable. Ermi Dutta, a member of the editorial board of the Community Psychology and Global Perspective journal, she suggested that we submit something to that journal. During the process of figuring out what direction we wanted to go with for the syllabus, we decided that we needed to expand our scope and create a special issue that would hopefully serve as a launching pad for the topic and for scholars who were interested in the topic. The special issue ended up emerging almost a full 2 years after our first biennial as a response to the growing need to increase the presence and discussion of these important topics within community psychology. With national attention being given to daily instances of racial injustice across the country, the need for a greater emphasis on this area has only increased since that first roundtable back in 2016, since this second roundtable back in 2017, and inclusive of what's happening now in 2021. It was also a perfect choice in terms of the type of research journal that we published this in. So with it being an open access journal, it also addressed another issue that we had increasingly been talking about and thinking about, which was the issue of the accessibility of academic research and discourse. So the idea that we publish primarily in peer-reviewed research journals that are usually behind a paywall kind of limits how much we can really disseminate the work or how accessible it is to the people who may actually need it. So I know for myself, I've tried to address this in a number of different ways of disseminating my work in more accessible ways. So whether it's through something like the TCP, where things are written in a much more digestible manner that could be easily translated to probably being more outwardly faced if we wanted, or this work I engaged in with my fellowship at the University of Michigan, in which I helped scholars write public scholarship essays that were able to sum down the essence of their work in a much more digestible and relatable manner than we typically would see in academic research journals. So I also ended up writing a couple of pieces for the online newsletter, or the online magazine Spark, and even got a chance to curate some articles and submissions from scholars on Black social movement. So I got to help write the introduction and curate the entire series and center it around Black social movements. I also have talked about my work in interviews on the Radioactive podcast, which was hosted by Natalie Kivel, who is an assistant professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. Maybe one day we can have her on here as a guest to talk about her work, but I've gone on there to talk about my own personal dissertation work. We also had a really great conversation with some other scholars about, truth versus post-truth, which was a very relevant conversation after the 2016 election. And we also had a Martin Luther King Jr. special episode in which I and Alana got to talk about our Black Lives Matter special issue and what we were looking for in terms of submissions and what we wanted out of it. And also just open access journals in general. I have a few publications that are in open access journals, and I really think that open access journals are valuable for the fact that it's not behind a paywall. If someone wanted to find it, they could find it and wouldn't have to go through any hassle of like getting it or having to have a university affiliation to access it. Like it's in the word, it's open access. So I think that's something else that we have always been thinking about in terms of, is our work actually getting out to those who need it the most? And what kind of power dynamics are being shown when we are writing in such a way that is kind of limiting who can actually access or use the work that we're producing or the products that we're producing? This leads to a question we should consider. What is the role of the intellectual? I would like to share this quote from historian of colonialism Walter Rodney. The challenge of intellectual life is to be found in dissent against the status quo at a time when the struggle on behalf of the underrepresented and disadvantaged groups still seems so unfairly weighted against them. I think it is important for intellectuals to remember that they are rooted in communities. One philosophical principle that underlines this is Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a core African philosophical principle. Community is central, and this is a form of African humanism that emphasizes interidentity and interrelationality with all dimensions of existence. A person is a person through their relationships. Individuality and interdependence are connected. Solidarity expands from solitary. So another key aspect of this is restorative justice. And restorative justice seeks to heal the harm to relationships and communities. It's a proactive relational strategy to create a culture of connectivity where everyone can thrive and feel valued. Such practices are related to lower incarceration and crime rates in African countries where they practice these more restorative justice techniques. Individual and community safety and security emerge from healthier and self-governing communities, not more police or prisons. This restorative justice component of Ubuntu explains the prominence of healers as archetypes of intellectuals throughout African diasporic societies and communities, whether it is the African priest, the hoodoo doctor, the preacher, psychiatrist, or psychologist. We hope that by sharing some of our experiences, we can spark some ideas on how we can move the field forward and address the pressing social issues of our time. We will share a list of resources and readings that guided our thinking and experiences with these topics.
Yes, so if there's any information here that sparked your interest, please refer to the list of readings and resources provided in the Reading Circle column. We started the Reading Circle column in winter of 2021, and we really look forward to adding additional readings and resources in the coming issues.
Please be on the lookout for the spring issue to be published in early April. In future episodes, we will discuss highlights from the TCP issues and bring on scholars and practitioners to talk about their work.
So if there's a topic that you would like to hear about or that you think should be featured in one of our TCP podcast episodes, please feel free to email us at tcp@scra.org. That's tcp@srca.org.
We hope you'll join us for another episode.
And until next time, it's been Dominique and Alana bringing you the TCP podcast.